Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Mallinson, or James Mallinson is my professional name, and I'm delighted to have been asked by Embodied Philosophy team to give the keynote lecture in this conference. The conference is on modern yoga scholarship, and that's what I do. I mean, I'm a yoga scholar, and now is modern times, and it's a really exciting time for yoga scholarship, and I'm delighted to be asked to talk about what I do. So I'm going to kind of contextualize what I do, and then I will just discuss some of my recent areas of research on the history of yoga. So my general research field is the history of yoga. The reason I got interested in this is actually not through yoga itself, but through yogis, through living with yogis in India, and then studying their texts. I was trained as a Sanskritist, and in order to learn more about the lives and the history, and to understand better the yogis who I lived with in India, and I still visit, I spend more of my time in the West these days, I decided to study the Sanskrit texts on yoga and on Hatha Yoga. Now this was, I started doing my PhD in 1995. I've already done a bit of work in the field then. I did an MA in ethnography, and I'd looked at various texts on yoga that were relevant to the lifestyles and the lives of the yogis that I was spending time with in India. But there were very few of those texts available. They hadn't really been assessed in a kind of general. There've been no good solid general overviews of the history of yoga, and in particular what is usually classified in secondary literature, i.e. not the texts themselves but scholarship more broadly, as Hatha Yoga. So I decided, but yeah, there have been studies and have been editions and publications of texts on Hatha Yoga, plenty of them prior to when I started working on the subject. But they were focused on 3 or 4 texts. I mean, the first scholars, there's actually really interesting, very brief studies going all the way back to 1850 by a British scholar called Edward Hall, it's just a catalogue of manuscripts, but he looked at quite a few manuscripts of the Hatha Pradipika and made some interesting observations, which are still useful today. And then there were the editions, but not critical editions. So when I say critical edition, I mean an edition where someone gets hold of all the manuscript material they can and works out not necessarily the original form of the text, but they try to establish the text at some particular point in its development. And there were none of those. There were these sort of rough editions, basically from maybe one or possibly 2 manuscripts. Chandra Vasu was probably one of the most well-known, and people produced, by the end of the 19th century, there were editions of texts such as the Hatha Pradipika, the Shiva Samhita, and the Gheranda Samhita. And really, since then, all scholarship on Hatha Yoga has really just been based on those 3 texts. There were some other studies. So Kalyani Malik in I think it was the 50s, she brought out some. She published editions, but again, they're what are called sort of diplomatic transcriptions. They're not even really editions of 5 or 6 texts associated with the Nath tradition. There was a scholar called, he's still alive actually, living in Hyderabad in Andhra Pradesh, called Venkata Reddy. He produced an edition of the Hatha Ratnavali. The Kaivalya Dharma Yoga in Lala, and then there was one offshoot. Apparently now there's another offshoot. They've produced various editions of text. Some of them are very good critical editions. But so the Hatha Pradipika, they've produced the only known critical edition of the Hatha Pradipika, which is perhaps the most important text on Hatha Yoga. At least it's had the greatest influence on subsequent scholarship. It was produced in probably 1450. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then there are some of these incredible Indian sort of polymath scholars who could write brilliant articles on just about anything. And there was P.K. Gode, or I'm never quite sure if it's Gode or Gode, a Marathi scholar who had a remarkable output. And he made a few comments on some yoga texts as well. But what we hadn't had at that point was any kind of diachronic overview, so looking at the development of the text, the development of the corpus, and trying to infer what the development of the practices and the people who were doing them and so forth. That changed in 1994 with the publication of a book called Les Hatha Yoga et les Upanishads by a French scholar called Christian Bouy, who worked at the Collège de France, which was a marvelous kind of extremely meticulous piece of philological scholarship where he looked at a lot of manuscript sources, and he kind of pivots around the Hatha Pradipika. He identified he basically confirmed the suspicions that people had raised before, but he really showed that the Hatha Pradipika, this very important kind of seminal text in the history of Hatha Yoga, was a compilation drawing on more than a dozen works, and he identified a lot of those borrowings. His work, he was interested in how these practices of Hatha Yoga, which first start getting taught in texts from probably the 11th century of the Common Era, and then in the 15th century we get this Hatha Pradipika compilation. Now after that, or from that time onwards, there's an increasing interest from Vedantic and kind of more orthodox mainstream traditions in India in these practices of Hatha Yoga. And that's really what his focus is. And he shows how in the 17th or 18th centuries, a corpus of Upanishads was put together, totaling 108, in which there are, I'm not sure, 15 or 20 texts, which later become classified as the Yoga Upanishads. And now most of those Yoga Upanishads didn't in fact exist at this point. The commentator, the compiler of this corpus of 108 Upanishads, needed to bulk the numbers up to some extent. And he used these earlier texts, which Bouy had identified some of. The compiler or compilers of these 108 Upanishads took these earlier texts and incorporated them, sometimes wholesale, into these new Upanishads. So that's the focus of Boui's work, which incidentally has just been translated by my colleague Jason Birch and another colleague Christelle Barrois. They've translated it from French into English with a new introduction. So hopefully it's going to be published by Routledge, I think, hopefully before too long. So it's incredibly useful, incredibly dense work. And so, yes, this was the first kind of solid philological, when I talk about philology, I mean, just getting your hands dirty, or figuratively speaking, in the text, looking closely at the text to try to understand the history of the subject. And it was thanks to Boui's work that I learned about a text called the Khetri Vidya, which only existed in manuscripts at the time. This was 1994. And I then decided to produce a critical edition of that text for my doctoral studies, which I did in Oxford under Professor Alexis Sanderson. And when I started work on that, it's difficult work. This philological work is difficult. It requires, you require quite a lot of training to get the skill in language and in Sanskrit to be able to make editorial decisions. So that aspect of it is technically difficult. It's also quite tedious in some ways, in that you should really try to collate all the readings from every single manuscript you can find of a text. Sometimes some texts that would be absurd. There are hundreds and hundreds, and then you have to make some sort of triage choices of which manuscripts you're going to look at, try to group them and so forth. But if it's fewer than that, then you really should look at them all. And when I started working on the Khetri Vidya, which is a relatively short text, 300 verses, I was aware of 6 manuscripts of the text, so that seemed pretty manageable. But by the end of my work on it, I was aware of nearly 30 witnesses, I think, in total. So that's my excuse for why my PhD took me rather longer than was planned. But I got there in the end, and it just does prove, actually. I mean, I think you know, that it was doing that work then. I kind of, you know, wasn't aware of what I was doing, or in terms of the broader methodology, or the history of that methodology, and or in fact the fact that hard, you know, difficult, focused philological work was actually very unfashionable in the broader academy at this time, particularly in the States, where it still struggles to some extent. You know, I'm told that, you know, there are colleagues of mine who don't want to do the sort of work I do because they won't get a job. You know, it's still frowned upon to some extent. But it really brought home to me the work I did on my PhD on the Khechri Vidya, that really, if you want to make big statements about your subject, you need to do the really small, tiny, meticulous, nitty-gritty work to understand what's going on. So to give you an example from the Khechri Vidya in particular, you know, there were lots of things I discovered just by comparing all the different manuscripts and trying to work out what had gone on in the transmission. Because of course, what one must remember is that the manuscripts don't go all the way back to the time when the text was written. Manuscripts in most places in India don't last for very long, so they tend to be copies. You know, Khechri Vidya was probably written in the 14th century, let's say. So manuscripts that exist now are likely to be at least the sort of 4th or 5th copy. You know, they rarely last more than a couple of hundred years. And what became apparent by comparing the manuscripts, so one very interesting example was that there's a group of manuscripts, or witnesses, as we might say, that where another group, the kind of more prominent, or the group that was, the group that had more manuscripts in many places where that had Khechri, so the name of the practice and the name of a type of flying yogini, that other group had Madira, which is a word that means alcohol, and conveniently is 3 syllables and the final syllable is long, so it was quite easy to substitute one for the other. But what was going on was, it then became clear that the text, as I presented it, so I presented it with the Khechri readings, but it became clear that the Madira readings were original, and that the Khechri readings had been kind of superimposed. The original text had been changed. The original text had come from a more as we might say, left-hand tantric tradition, in which the use of alcohol and sexual rituals and so forth was prevalent. But then when the text actually attained its more popular form, when it became more current among practitioners of Hatha Yoga, in particular Khechri Mudra, which is the central practice of the text, by that time, these left-hand practices had been dismissed. And that, as I say, you know, you only get to understand this through wading through tiny variations in different manuscripts and so forth. And that's why when I came to the end of my PhD, and I then went back to what scholarship there was that gave some sort of general overviews on the principles and histories of Hatha Yoga, it became apparent that that did not match what I was seeing in the Khechri Vidya, and also I'd been looking at other manuscripts round about, and also it didn't really tally with what I'd been seeing in the field as well. You know, some of the pronouncements about, for example, the Nath yogis being the original proponents of Hatha Yoga. Meanwhile, you couldn't find any Nath yogis in India who did any asana, you know, any complex asana practice, but there were plenty of yogis from other traditions who did. And, you know, these things just didn't all tally. And so it was then at that point that I realized that in order to make sense of this tradition as a whole, I kind of needed to go back to first principles and look at all the texts on the subject of Hatha Yoga, and look at all their manuscripts, kind of start from the bottom up, and then only then would one be able to be confident in making general pronouncements about the history of the subject. And so that's what I did. Help work and sent me manuscripts and so forth. He died. I think it was probably around 2000. And there weren't really any other scholars working in the field. I was kind of on my own. I mean, there are some connections between between the texts of the Hatha Yoga corpus and those of Tantra. And so it was extremely useful to be working with Professor Sanderson and also making a network of colleagues there with a wider world of this sort of new flourishing subject of Shaiva Tantra. And then also I've become aware of, as I will explain shortly, had to come to understand Buddhist Tantra as well, because that has a direct relevance on Hatha Yoga. Now, what do I mean by Hatha Yoga? That again, so this is a question that's really been occupying me recently, because what happened in my work after I finished my PhD is I got offered a job with the Clay Sanskrit Library as a translator of Sanskrit poetry, and that job went on for 7 or 8 years, and it was a wonderful job because it gave me a lot of freedom. I was able to work extremely hard on those translations for a few months of the year, and then and devote the rest of my time to continuing what I've been doing before, which was sort of wandering around India and finding manuscripts and working on these Hatha Yoga texts. So I was chipping away at all of that. And then the Clay project came to an end about 2009, 2010. I was slightly out in the wilderness in terms of an academic career, and I published, but I had all this material that I've been working on and all this, I've been thinking all this stuff through. I hadn't really been under any obligation. I didn't have a university job, so there was no publish or perish kind of pressure. But then suddenly I wondered, okay, what am I going to do now? What am I fit for? I'm only fit for academia. And I got out a few articles on the strength of that. Was very lucky, because it's difficult these days, but I got a university position at SOAS in London, University of London. And I instantly applied for the biggest grant available with a project called this Hatha Yoga project. And by that time there was another scholar, Jason Birch, he'd done his doctoral studies also at Oxford under Professor Sanderson. I think he completed in 2013 on a text called the Amanaska Yoga. And so he did a very thorough philological study of that text, which is definitely the same genre as all the Hatha texts. It's closely related, although one can't really call it a Hatha Yoga text because it's really quite rude about Hatha Yoga. It teaches Raja Yoga and distinguishes that kind of, Raja Yoga, which again I will talk a bit more about, it distinguishes that from the sort of tougher practices of Hatha Yoga, and says that there's no point in kind of troubling yourself with the practices of Hatha Yoga. Anyway, in the project proposal, I was delighted when I asked Jason if he would join the team. He did, and then also Mark Singleton, who I was already working with on a project for a book called Roots of Yoga, and so Mark brought this great expertise in that he's a great expert on the history of the development of modern yoga, as can be seen in his well-known book Yoga Body, and I believe he's also given a talk in this series. His interests were beginning to look back a bit. I was beginning to look a bit more forward, and Jason was kind of in the middle. Although, having said that, his Amanaska text actually dates to what's probably as early as any of the Hatha Yoga corpus. But when we kind of worked out how the team would function, although we all kind of look at everyone else's work and we all collaborate on just about everything, my specialized area is early Hatha Yoga, so from 11th to 15th century. Jason's is sort of late pre-modern Hatha Yoga, so he's looking at sort of 16th to 18th, 19th century. Mark's kind of looking at the whole spread, but also he's got the best understanding of the development of modern yoga, so he can tie it in with that. And we were very lucky. We got funded. We won the lottery of kind of academic lottery. We got one of these huge ERC grants, so we're kind of in academic swarg, academic heaven at the moment. We're halfway through, more or less, a 5-year project, and the core of the project is critical editions of 10 texts on Hatha Yoga, all Sanskrit texts.